Robert Downey Jr. walked into the small-town diner on a quiet Saturday evening, looking like anything but the Hollywood superstar everyone knew. Dressed in a plain hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days, he could have been mistaken for a tired traveler passing through. But what happened next would leave everyone in the diner stunned, and one man wishing he had kept his mouth shut. Before we dive into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy surprising stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Robert chose a booth in the far corner, away from the chatter of a few locals enjoying their meals. He didn't look around or try to draw attention. Instead, he calmly opened the menu, his face partially hidden by a baseball cap. It wasn't long before trouble found him. A loud voice cut through the hum of the jukebox and the clinking of silverware. "This place is a joke," said a man sitting at the counter. He wore a fancy suit and shiny shoes that looked wildly out of place in the old-fashioned diner. He glanced around with a smirk, clearly unimpressed by the small-town charm. "What kind of dump doesn't even have Wi-Fi?" The man's name was Dan. He was a business consultant, passing through town on his way to a big client meeting. Dan was the type who thought he was better than everyone else. He acted like the world revolved around him. And he didn't care if his words hurt people. Dan spotted Robert sitting alone in the corner. Something about him, a guy in a hoodie, minding his own business, seemed to bother Dan. "Hey," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You. Lose your way to the bus station, buddy? Or is this where you come for free coffee?" The whole diner went quiet. Even the waitress, a young woman named Sarah, froze in her tracks, unsure of what to do. Robert looked up from his menu, his expression calm. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up the glass of water in front of him and took a sip, acting as if Dan hadn't said a word. That only made Dan angrier. "What? You can't talk?" Dan said, walking over to Robert's booth. He crossed his arms and stared down at him, waiting for a reaction. "Maybe you're just shy. Or maybe..." Dan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough so only Robert could hear. "You can't afford to be here." Robert calmly folded the menu and placed it on the table. He looked up at Dan, his face still calm and unreadable. "I'm just here for the coffee," he said simply. Dan laughed. "Oh, I can tell guys like you don't exactly come to places like this to eat." He turned to Sarah, the waitress, and snapped his fingers. "Hey, sweetheart, why don't you bring my friend here a bowl of soup or something cheap? Maybe even on the house. Looks like he could use it." Sarah hesitated, glancing nervously between Dan and Robert. But Robert just gave her a small smile and shook his head. "I'm fine," he said softly. But Dan wasn't done. He leaned against the edge of the booth, smirking. "You know, I almost feel bad for you. It must be tough not having anything to your name, just wandering around trying to find a place to fit in." Robert said nothing. He simply picked up his glass of water again, took another sip, and set it back down. The silence in the diner was so thick you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Dan straightened up and shook his head, chuckling as he walked back to his seat at the counter. "Unbelievable," he said loudly. "You're addressing no one in particular. Guy probably doesn't even have $1 in his pocket, and he's just sitting here, taking up space." Sarah finally approached Robert's booth, her cheeks flushed. "I'm so sorry about him," she whispered, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "He's always like this." Robert gave her a kind smile. "It's okay," he said. "I've dealt with worse." But what no one in the diner realized was that Robert Downey Jr. wasn't just another customer. And soon, Dan would regret every word he'd said. Dan sat at the counter, tapping his expensive leather shoes against the floor. He leaned back on his stool, smirking as he sipped his coffee, clearly pleased with himself. The other diners exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves about his rude behavior. Meanwhile, Robert Downey Jr. remained calm in his booth. He wasn't bothered by Dan's comments or the attention the exchange had drawn. Instead, He quietly thanked Sarah for the coffee and took another sip, his relaxed demeanor in stark contrast to Dan's loud, arrogant energy. Dan, however, wasn't done. He looked around the diner, his voice carrying across the room. "This town really is something else," he said with a chuckle. "A guy like me sticks out like a sore thumb here. No offense, but it's like stepping back in time. I mean, look at this place." He waved his hand toward the old jukebox in the corner and the mismatched chairs and tables. "Some of us like it this way," Sarah said softly as she passed, with a tray of plates. "Oh, I'm sure you do," Dan said with a smirk. "I mean, you have to, right? Not everyone's cut out for the big city." Sarah frowned but said nothing, hurrying to deliver the food to another table. Dan turned his attention back to Robert, who was still sitting quietly, staring out the window as if he hadn't heard a word. This seemed to bother Dan even more. He got up from his stool and walked back over to Robert's booth. "You know," Dan said, leaning on the edge of the booth again, "you've got this whole strong, silent act down, but it's not fooling anyone. You're just like the rest of this town, stuck small and going nowhere." The diner grew even quieter. All eyes were on the two men now. Even the sound of the jukebox seemed to fade into the background. Robert finally looked up at Dan, his face calm but serious. "Is there something you need?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Dan laughed, shaking his head. "I don't need anything. I'm just trying to understand why someone like you is here. You don't exactly look like you belong in a place like this." "I could say the same about you," Robert replied, his voice steady. Dan's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Touché," he said, crossing his arms. "But the difference is, I'm just passing through. People like you, though. This is your whole world, isn't it? This tiny little diner, this tiny little town." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Let me guess, you're one of those guys who peaked in high school, and now you're just coasting. Am I right?" Robert didn't respond right away. Instead, he picked up his coffee cup and took another sip, his calm gaze never leaving Dan's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. No, you don't have to put other people down to feel better about yourself." Dan blinked, caught off guard by the simple statement. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. But then he laughed, shaking his head. "Nice try," he said. "But don't think for a second that some little life lesson from you is gonna make me rethink anything. I know exactly who I am, and I'm proud of it." Robert didn't argue. He simply set his coffee cup down and leaned back in his seat, his calm expression unchanged. Sarah, who had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, finally stepped in. She walked over to Dan, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "Maybe you should leave him alone. He hasn't done anything to you." Dan turned to her, his smirk returning. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart. I'm just having a little fun." "Well, it's not funny," Sarah said, her voice a little stronger now. "And it's not right." Dan rolled his eyes but stepped back from Robert's booth, raising his hands as if to say he was done. Fine, he said. "I'll leave the guy alone. Wouldn't want to hurt his feelings." He walked back to the counter, but the tension in the diner remained thick. Everyone could feel it. Something was coming. Robert picked up his coffee again, taking another sip. He glanced at Sarah and gave her a small nod of thanks. She smiled nervously before retreating behind the counter. Dan, meanwhile, sat back on his stool, clearly still enjoying the attention. He didn't realize that his words and actions were about to come back to haunt him in a way he could never have expected. The diner buzzed with quiet whispers. People leaned closer to their tables, pretending to eat while keeping their eyes on Dan and Robert. Something about the calm way Robert handled Dan's jabs made everyone curious. Who was this guy? Dan, on the other hand, was still talking, mostly to himself but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know what's funny about places like this," he said, spinning his coffee cup on the counter. "Everyone's so content with just enough. No ambition, no drive. It's like they've already given up on life." He turned to Sarah again, a smug grin plastered on his face. "What about you, sweetheart? Is this your big dream? Slinging coffee in a diner until you retire?" Sarah froze mid-step, the pot of coffee trembling slightly in her hand. Her lips pressed into a tight line, but before she could respond, Robert spoke up. "Why do you care?" His voice was calm, but it cut through the air like a knife. Dan turned, surprised to see Robert looking directly at him. For the first time, Robert's expression wasn't just calm, it was focused. "I'm sorry." "What?" Dan asked, pretending not to hear him. "I said, why do you care?" Robert repeated. "You don't know her. You don't know her story. So why are you so interested in tearing her down?" The room went completely silent. Even the faint hum of the jukebox seemed to stop. Dan blinked, then laughed nervously. "Oh, come on," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "It's just a joke, lighten up." "It didn't sound like a joke," Robert said. "It sounded like you were trying to make her feel small. Why would you do that?" Dan's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Okay, I get it," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're the good guy here, swooping to defend the waitress. Very noble." "I'm not trying to be a hero," Robert said, leaning back in his booth. "I just don't like bullies." The word bullies seemed to hang in the air, echoing in the quiet diner. Few people nodded subtly, and Sarah's shoulders relaxed just a little. Dan's face turned red, but he quickly forced a laugh. "Bullies? Me? That's rich coming from a guy who's probably never had to work for anything in his life." Robert raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his coffee and took another sip, his calm demeanor only making Dan more frustrated. "Let me guess," Dan continued, stepping closer to Robert's booth again. "You're one of those guys who talks big about kindness and humility but has nothing to show for it. Am I right? No job, no goals, just drifting through life and pretending that makes you better than everyone else." Robert finally set his coffee cup down and looked up at Dan. His gaze was steady, unshaken. "You sure seem to know a lot about me," he said. Dan smirked. "It's not hard to figure out. Guys like you are everywhere, always ready to judge others while doing nothing with your own lives. You probably don't even know what success looks like." At that moment, the door to the diner jingled as it opened. A man in a dark suit and sunglasses stepped inside, scanning the room. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he walked straight toward Robert's booth. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, stopping beside Robert. "I just wanted to confirm that the arrangements for your meeting later are all set. The driver is outside whenever you're ready." Dan froze, his smirk fading instantly. The rest of the diner fell silent again, every pair of eyes now glued to Robert. Robert gave the man a small nod. "Thanks, Paul," he said casually. "I'll be out in a bit." The man nodded and left as quickly as he'd arrived, leaving the diner in stunned silence. Dan stared at Robert, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. What was that about?" Dan finally managed to ask, his voice cracking slightly. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You said I probably don't know what success looks like," he said. "But maybe you don't know what kindness looks like. Or respect." Dan's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He glanced around the diner, realizing that everyone was watching him, and not in a good way. "What's going on?" Dan demanded, his voice louder now. "Who are you?" Robert didn't answer right away. He picked up his coffee, took another sip, and smiled. "I'm just someone who came here for a quiet cup of coffee," he said. "But you made anything but quiet." The tension in the room was unbearable. Everyone was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see what would happen next. Dan's hands clenched the edge of the counter as he stared at Robert, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. The air in the diner felt heavy as everyone waited for Robert to say more, but he just sat there, calm as ever, sipping his coffee. "You didn't answer my question," Dan said, his voice cracking slightly. "Who are you?" Robert set his mug down and tilted his head slightly. "Why does it matter?" he asked, his tone steady. Dan laughed nervously, glancing around the diner for support, but no one spoke. Even Sarah, who had been silently rooting for Robert, stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. "It matters because," Dan stammered, struggling to find the words, "because this doesn't make sense. Who has a guy like that?" He pointed toward the suited man who had just left. "Waiting for them outside a place like this?" Robert leaned back in his seat and smiled faintly. "Maybe you've got the wrong idea about this place," he said, "or about me." Dan shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "No, you're messing with me," he said, his voice rising. "Nobody just shows up at a diner like this with a driver waiting outside. It doesn't add up." A soft murmur spread through the room as the other diners whispered to each other, their curiosity growing by the second. "Okay, fine," Dan said, throwing up his hands. "You're some big-shot businessman or whatever. Is that it, trying to keep a low profile? Let me guess. You came here to remind yourself of your humble roots or something cliché like that?" Robert chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not quite," he said. "Then what?" Dan demanded. "What's the deal? Who are you?" The tension in the diner reached its peak as Robert finally stood up, pushing his chair back gently. He adjusted his baseball cap, looked Dan straight in the eye, and said calmly, "My name is Robert Downey Jr." The room went dead silent. Dan blinked, the name hanging in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. He looked at Robert, his eyes narrowing as if trying to process what he'd just heard. "No," Dan said, shaking his head. "No. Wait, or you're messing with me." But the murmurs from the other customers quickly turned into hushed exclamations. A young couple at a nearby table pulled out their phone to double-check his face, their eyes widening in shock. "Oh my gosh," Sarah whispered from behind the counter. "It really is him." Dan's face paled as the realization hit him. "Wait, you're serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert gave a small nod, his expression calm but firm. "You seemed pretty sure you had me all figured out," he said. "But you didn't even take the time to look closer." Dan stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. He opened his mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. The other diners were now fully engaged, their eyes darting between Robert and Dan. Some whispered excitedly, while others stared in awe, unsure of how to react. "Listen," Robert continued, his voice steady. "I didn't come here to cause a scene. I came here because I wanted a quiet moment, a cup of coffee, and a place where I didn't have to be Robert Downey Jr., but you made a lot of assumptions about me, and about everyone else in this room." Dan's shoulders slumped as the weight of Robert's words sank in. His arrogance, his mocking comments, and his need to feel superior now felt incredibly small in the grand scheme of things. "I didn't know," Dan mumbled, barely able to look at Robert. "That's the thing about assumptions," Robert said. "They don't require you to know anything. You just decide who people are without ever giving them a chance." The room was so quiet, you could hear the faint buzz of the neon open sign near the door. Sarah's eyes were wide, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Even the young couple who had been scrolling on their phone put it down, captivated by the moment. Dan looked around the room, his confidence completely shattered. I didn't mean," he started, but his voice trailed off. Robert held up a hand to stop him. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," he said, "but maybe you should think about why you felt the need to tear other people down in the first place." Dan swallowed hard, his face red with embarrassment. The other diners watched him closely, their expressions a mix of disapproval and pity. For a moment, it seemed like Dan might storm out of the diner, unable to handle the humiliation. But instead, he stood there, frozen, as Robert calmly sat back down in his booth, picking up his coffee like nothing had happened. The silence stretched on, and everyone in the diner waited to see what Dan would do next. Before we continue, have you ever been in a situation like this? Maybe you've seen someone misjudge another person? Or maybe you've been on the receiving end. Let us know in the comments, your stories matter too. And hey, if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one. There's plenty more where this came from. Now, let's continue. Dan stood there, frozen in place, his mind spinning as Robert's words echoed in his head. The quiet of the diner felt suffocating now. All the smugness and confidence he'd carried with him when he walked in had evaporated, leaving him exposed in front of a room full of strangers and in front of Robert Downey Jr. The other customers watched him closely, some shaking their heads, others whispering quietly to each other. Dan felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He glanced at Sarah, who was still behind the counter, and saw the look in her eyes, part disbelief, part disappointment. "I didn't know," Dan mumbled again, his voice barely audible. "You didn't want to know," Robert said, breaking the silence. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried a certain weight that made Dan flinch. "You were so focused on tearing people down, you didn't stop to think about who they were or what they might be dealing with." Dan's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he didn't have a sarcastic comment or a clever comeback. He looked down at the floor, his face burning with shame. I don't know why I said those things," he said quietly, more to himself than to Robert. Robert leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "I think you do," he said calmly. "Sometimes, when people feel small, they try to make other people feel even smaller. It doesn't fix anything, but it gives them something to hide behind." Dan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Small," he said, his voice defensive. "I'm not small. I've worked hard to get where I am." "I'm sure you have," Robert replied. "But success isn't just about what you've achieved. It's about how you treat the people around you." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Everyone was hanging on Robert's every word, waiting to see what Dan would do. Dan opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. Deep down, he knew Robert was right. He thought back to the things he'd said, not just today, but in so many other moments like this. How many people had he put down? How many strangers had he judged without knowing anything about them? "I don't know why I do it," Dan admitted, his voice shaking slightly. I guess it's just easier to act like I have it all figured out than to admit I don't." Robert nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It takes a lot to admit that," he said, "but the real work comes next. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be. Someone who builds people up, or someone who tears them." And Dan swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He glanced around the diner, seeing the faces of the people who had witnessed his behavior. For the first time, he felt the weight of their judgment, not as something to fight against, but as something to learn from. "I'm sorry," Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Sarah, who was still standing behind, the counter watching him carefully. "I was rude and I shouldn't have said any of those things. You didn't deserve that." Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback by the apology. After a moment, she gave him a small nod. "Thank you," she said softly. Dan turned back to Robert, his face flushed with embarrassment. "And you, I don't even know where to start. I feel like an idiot." Robert smiled faintly, picking up his coffee. "That's a good place to start," he said. "The real question is, what are you going to do next?" Dan hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But he nodded slowly, so as if making a silent promise to himself. "I'll figure it out," he said quietly. Robert didn't press him further. He leaned back in his booth, taking another sip of his coffee as if the conversation had never happened. But the lesson hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt by everyone in the room. Dan shuffled back to the counter and sat down, his posture smaller than before. He kept his eyes on the coffee cup in front of him, clearly lost in thought. The tension in the diner began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Sarah returned to work, her movements a little lighter now. The other customers settled back into their meals, but they glanced at Robert with newfound respect, and at Dan with a mix of pity and understanding. The world outside the diner carried on as if nothing had happened. But for those inside, it was a moment they wouldn't soon forget. The sun was setting outside the diner, casting a warm orange glow through the windows. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The tension that once filled the room had been replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Conversations had resumed, but they were softer now, as if people didn't want to break the calm that had settled over the place. Robert Downey Jr. finished the last sip of his coffee and stood up from his booth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, leaving far more than the cost of his meal. He placed the money under his empty mug and looked toward Sarah, who was watching him from behind the counter. "Thanks for the coffee," he said with a small smile. Sarah smiled back, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert adjusted his cap and turned toward the door, but before he left, he glanced back at Dan, who was still sitting at the counter, staring into his coffee cup like it held all the answers he was searching for. "Good luck," Robert said to him, his tone kind but firm. Dan looked up, surprised. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Then he gave a small, hesitant nod. "Thanks," he said quietly. As Robert walked out of the diner, the faint jingle of the doorbell signaled his departure. The other customers watched him leave, their eyes following him until he disappeared into the evening light. Outside, a sleek black car was waiting for him. The driver stepped out and opened the door, but Robert paused before getting in. He looked back at the diner for a moment, taking in the sight of the small, unassuming building. Then, with a faint smile, he got into the car, and it pulled away, leaving the quiet town behind. Back inside the diner, Dan finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "He didn't have to do that," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Sarah tilted her head, curious. "Do what?" she asked. "Call me out like that," Dan said. He could have just ignored. But he didn't. He made me think, Sarah smiled softly. "Sometimes that's what people need the most," she said. Dan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He thought about all the things Robert had said, about assumptions, kindness, and the kind of person you choose to be. For the first time in a long time, Dan wasn't thinking about himself or how he looked to others. He was thinking about how he could be better. The rest of the diners quietly returned to their meals, but the story of what had happened would stay with them. Robert Downey Jr. had left more than a generous tip. He'd left a lesson that everyone in that room would carry with them. And here's where we leave you with a question. What kind of person do you want to be? Are you lifting people up, or are you letting your own fears and insecurities bring others down? If this story inspired you, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you can catch more stories like this one. Sometimes the smallest moments can teach the biggest lessons.